In the summer of 1845, the British Empire believed it was sending its finest sailors into history. Instead, it sent them into oblivion. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, built for war, reinforced with iron, swallowed by the Arctic while hunting the Northwest Passage. 129 men departed England. Not one returned alive. For nearly 2 centuries, all the ice gave back was fragments. Scattered bones, abandoned camps, broken boats, and questions. Why were 3 sailors already in their graves during the very first winter? Why was a skeleton found face down on the ice carrying another man's papers? And why did a captain's bones finally end a lie Britain told for over a century? The mystery ends here, with proof. To understand how 129 men vanished, you have to understand what sent them north in the first place. By the 1840s, the European empires had mapped almost the entire surface of the planet. The coastlines were charted, the continents were crossed, but one prize remained, and it had defeated every attempt for 300 years. The Northwest Passage, a navigable sea route over the top of North America, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific through the Arctic ice. If it existed, and if a nation could claim it, that nation would hold the shortcut between Europe and Asia, and the trade of the world would bend toward its flag. Britain wanted it more than anyone. For decades, the Royal Navy hurled expeditions into those frozen waters. Some limped home with crushed hulls and missing fingers. Some never came home at all. And every failure, instead of ending the obsession, fed it. The Arctic became a proving ground, the place where courage, endurance, and imperial ambition were tested against the coldest environment on Earth. And by the summer of 1845, Britain believed the test was finally rigged in its favor. Because this time, the Empire was not sending wooden sailboats into the ice, it was sending machines. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were not ordinary vessels. They had been built as bomb ships, warships designed to absorb the recoil of heavy mortars, which meant their frames were already among the strongest afloat. For the Arctic, they were rebuilt into something new. Their hulls were sheathed in iron plating to shoulder through pack ice. Steam locomotive engines were lowered into their holds and converted to drive propellers so that when the wind died, the ships would not. They carried a library, heated cabins, and enough tinned provisions to last 3 years. This was the Victorian machine age aimed directly at the top of the world, and the Admiralty was confident nature would give way. Commanding it all was Sir John Franklin. 59 years old, a veteran of previous Arctic expeditions, famous across Britain, a man whose name alone reassured the public that the passage was as good as found. Some thought him too old for the ice. The Admiralty thought his experience outweighed his years, and Franklin accepted the command that would define him forever. On May 19, 1845, the expedition slipped its moorings at Greenland, England, and turned north. The last stop was Greenland. The crews mailed their final letters home, and those letters survive. They are cheerful. The men wrote of good health, high spirits, and total confidence. Officers joked about completing the passage in a single season. Nothing in those pages reads like men in danger. Then the 2 ships sailed west into Baffin Bay. In late July, a pair of whaling vessels sighted them moored to an iceberg, waiting for the ice to open. The whalers exchanged greetings and sailed on, and that was the last time anyone ever saw the Franklin expedition alive. After that, silence. And here's the detail that makes the silence worse. At first, nobody worried. Arctic expeditions were expected to go dark, sometimes for a year or more, locked in the winter ice with no way to send word. The Empire waited patiently for triumphant news. 1 year passed, then 2. The patience began to crack. By the 3rd year, patience had turned into something else entirely, and Britain launched the largest search in its history for 2 ships that had sailed off the edge of the known world. What the searchers eventually found would be worse than anything they feared. The search for the Franklin expedition became an obsession that consumed the empire that launched it. Dozens of expeditions went north, some funded by the Admiralty, some by private donors, some by foreign nations drawn into the drama. And at the center of it all stood one person who refused to let the story die. Lady Jane Franklin, the commander's wife. When the Admiralty's urgency faded, she spent her own fortune, lobbied Parliament, wrote to presidents, and shamed the Empire into sending ship after ship. Because of her, the search continued long past the point where anyone believed the men were still alive. The question was no longer rescue. The question was truth. The Arctic became a giant graveyard search, and in 1850, the graveyard gave up its first secret. On a small, gravel-covered island called Beechey, searchers found the expedition's first winter camp, and beside it, 3 graves, cut into the permafrost, marked with wooden headboards, preserved so perfectly that the names could still be read. 3 young sailors, dead in the expedition's very first winter. Stop on that detail, because the searchers certainly did. This was the best-equipped polar expedition ever launched, provisioned for 3 years, barely months into its voyage. And it was already burying its men. If sailors were dying in year 1, something had gone wrong from the beginning. The graves offered no explanation, just names, dates, and frozen ground. For 9 more years, the ice kept the rest of the story. Then, in 1859, an expedition financed by Lady Franklin herself and led by Francis Leopold McClintock reached King William Island, far to the south of Beechey. And there, stacked by human hands on a windswept point, stood a cairn of stones. Inside it was a single sheet of paper, 1 page, written on twice, and it remains the only narrative document the expedition ever left behind. The Victory Point Note. The first message, written in May 1847, was routine. It reported the ships frozen into the ice stream off King William Island since September 1846, and ended with the words, "All well." The second message was scrawled around the margins of the first 11 months later, and nothing about it was well. It reported that Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847, barely 2 weeks after the first message claimed all was fine. It reported 9 officers and 15 men dead, and it reported that in April 1848, the 105 survivors had abandoned both ships to the ice and were marching south on foot, dragging boats and supplies by hand, aiming for a river on the mainland hundreds of kilometers away, through one of the harshest environments on the planet. 105 men walked out onto that ice. Not one of them made it. The note explained the what. It could not explain the why, and it could not name the dead. And then, just weeks after opening the cairn, McClintock found something that would haunt the case for the next century and a half. On the western coast of King William Island, lying face down where he had fallen, was a skeleton. The man had died walking, alone, still moving south, and in his clothing were handwritten papers, pages of notes and poetry, carrying a name. Here is the problem. The name on the papers and the uniform on the body did not agree. And for 160 years, nobody on Earth could prove whether the man and the name belonged to each other. It was May 25th, 1859. McClintock's party was working its way along the western coast of King William Island when they found him. A skeleton, face down in the gravel, nearly 130 kilometers from where the ships had been abandoned. He had not been buried. He had not been arranged. He had simply fallen forward, mid-stride, on the march south, and the Arctic had kept him exactly as he dropped. Around the remains were the small belongings of a sailor, and among them, a bundle of handwritten papers, pages of personal notes, fragments of poetry, sea songs and memories written in a looping hand, some of it spelled backward like a private code. Those pages would become known as the Peglar Papers, named for the man they appeared to identify, Harry Peglar, captain of the foretop, a skilled seaman of HMS Terror. And that name mattered enormously because those papers are among the only personal written materials ever recovered from the entire expedition. 129 men, 3 years of provisions, 2 ships full of journals, logs, and letters, and the ice returned almost none of it. Except this. A dead man's pocket, holding the only surviving voice. But there was a problem, and it surfaced almost immediately. The clothing on the skeleton did not match Harry Peglar. The body was dressed in the manner of a ship's steward, an officer's servant, not a captain of the foretop. The uniform said one man, the papers said another, which left two possibilities, and historians spent generations trapped between them. Either this was Peglar himself, dressed in whatever clothing survival demanded at the end of the world, where rank meant nothing and warmth meant everything. Or this was a different man entirely, a friend, perhaps the steward Peglar had served with years before, carrying a dead comrade's papers south, trying to bring a lost man's words home to his family. Sit with that second image for a moment, because it changes the meaning of everything found on that beach. Was this a man carrying his own poetry, or a man carrying his friend's memory? For 160 years, there was no way to know. The debate became legendary among Franklin researchers precisely because it could not be closed, and it was one uncertainty inside a much larger one, because the face-down man was not alone. Across King William Island and the Adelaide Peninsula, the land the survivors marched through, bones kept surfacing. Search parties found them in the 1850s. Inuit hunters knew where they lay and said so. Scientists collected them in the 20th century. Skulls, limbs, scattered fragments of more than a few men, strewn along the line of that final desperate march. And every one of them was anonymous. Were these the sailors of Erebus and Terror, or the remains of others who had died in the ice across the centuries? The bones could not say. The expedition had become a mystery, with physical evidence everywhere and names nowhere. Graves without stories on Beechey, a note without names in the cairn, papers without a proven owner on the coast, bones without identities across two landmasses. Everything the Arctic returned was orphaned. And looming behind all of it, the two largest pieces of evidence on Earth were still missing entirely. Two reinforced warships, over 100 feet long, packed with the documents, possessions, and answers of 129 men, had spent a century and a half somewhere beneath the Arctic, unfound. Until the day a search team finally stopped looking at the ice and started looking under it. For 169 years, the ships were ghosts. Generations of searchers had crossed the ice above them. Sonar technology matured, satellite mapping arrived, and still, two of the strongest vessels the Royal Navy ever modified stayed hidden. Then the searchers did what the searchers of the 1850s could not. They listened to the people who had been there. Inuit oral tradition had described the fate of the ships for generations, including accounts of a vessel that drifted south and sank in shallow water near an island where local hunters had seen its masts. For a long time, those accounts were filed away the way oral history usually is, respected in speeches and ignored in practice. When modern search teams finally treated them as testimony, the ghosts began to surface. In 2014, a Canadian search expedition found HMS Erebus, resting beneath the Arctic waters almost exactly where Inuit accounts had placed a sinking ship. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was located, sitting upright in the cold dark of a bay that carries her name, so astonishingly well preserved that dishes still sat on shelves and glass still stood in the window panes of the captain's cabin. The headlines wrote themselves. After nearly 170 years, the Franklin mystery was solved. Except it was not. Understand what the ships actually answered and what they could not. The wrecks answered where. They confirmed the drift of the ice, the path of the disaster, the truth of the Inuit accounts. But the ships were empty of the one thing the mystery had always really been about. The men. The bones, scattered across King William Island and the Adelaide Peninsula, were still anonymous. The face-down man still had no proven name. The story remained a story about machines and ice, when it had always underneath been a story about 129 human beings. To give the bones back their names, science would have to do something far harder than finding two shipwrecks. It would have to connect Arctic remains to living people across nearly 2 centuries. This is where the genetic work begins. Researchers extracted DNA from bones and teeth recovered at the Franklin sites, material weathered by more than 150 Arctic winters. That was only half the method. The other half happened in archives. To identify a sailor, you need someone to compare him to, which means finding his living descendants. And to qualify, those descendants had to prove their connection through direct maternal or paternal lines, documented step by step across nearly 200 years, naval muster rolls, birth certificates, church registries, family trees built branch by branch through wars, emigrations, and name changes. One missing record, and a line goes dark. It is the same unforgiving genealogical work that identified a king under a parking lot, applied now to ordinary sailors scattered across the top of the world. And incredibly, it worked. In 2021, researchers announced the first confirmed identification in the history of the Franklin expedition. His name was John Gregory, an engineer aboard HMS Erebus, a man who had tended the locomotive engine in the ship's hold, matched by DNA to a living descendant. After 176 years, one of the 129 finally had his name back. And a method that works once is not a discovery. It is a door. Because once the first identification held, the process could be repeated, bone by bone, archive by archive. The names began coming back. And one of them had been lying face down on that western coastline since 1848, waiting out the longest argument in Franklin scholarship. After John Gregory came 4 more names. Researchers announced the identification of William Oren, David Young, John Bridgens, and Harry Peglar. 4 sailors, pulled back out of anonymity by the same unforgiving method, ancient DNA on one side, documented living descendants on the other, and a match in the middle. 3 of them were identified from remains recovered at Erebus Bay, ground the survivors crossed on their final march. But the 4th name is the one that ended a legend. Harry Peglar, the face-down man, or rather, the question that had hung over the face-down man for 160 years. Remember the 2 possibilities the evidence allowed. Either the skeleton on the western coast was Peglar himself, dressed in a steward's clothing because the end of the world does not care about uniforms, or it was another man, likely a friend, carrying Peglar's papers south in his pocket, trying to bring a dead comrade's words home. Generations of historians argued it. Books took sides. The single most personal artifact of the entire expedition, the only surviving human voice from 129 men, hung on an identity nobody could prove. The laboratory closed the argument. The DNA came back, and the answer was Peglar. The skeleton and the papers belonged to the same man. Harry Peglar, captain of the foretop of HMS Terror, died walking south with his own poetry in his pocket, and fell face forward onto the gravel of King William Island, where he lay unclaimed for over a century and a half. The debate was over, and the resolution matters far beyond one grave. Because with the identity proven, the Peglar papers transform. They are no longer pages of uncertain origin, interesting but unanchored. They are the authenticated voice of a Franklin sailor, the only one the ice ever gave back. The sea songs, the fragments of memory, the lines written backward in his private way, all of it now connects to a documented human being with a name, a rank, a ship, and a family line that continues to this day. For the first time in over 160 years, historians can read those pages knowing exactly whose hands wrote them and whose pocket carried them. Now, honesty demands a caveat, and it is an important one. Of the 129 men who sailed with Franklin, only a handful have been conclusively identified. The rest remain where the Arctic put them, scattered across islands, buried under gravel, or beneath ice that shifts and closes. Some were never found, some never will be. The identification project is not a finished monument, it is an open door, and researchers continue asking descendants of Franklin crew members to come forward and contribute DNA, because every new sample is a chance to hand another skeleton back its name. That is the honest state of the evidence. A method proven, a handful of names restored, and a long list still waiting. But among the remains that science did identify, there was one more. A senior officer this time, one of the expedition's commanders, a man photographed before departure in his dress uniform, confident and composed. And his bones carried something the others did not. Markings. Deliberate, unmistakable, and devastating. Marks that answered the question Victorian Britain had spent a century refusing to ask. The question whispered since the first search parties came home, the one the Empire called slander and buried alongside its dead. What did the last survivors actually do to stay alive? The answer had been carved into the evidence all along. His name was James Fitzjames, captain of HMS Erebus, one of the most senior officers of the entire expedition. He was the man who wrote the Victory Point note, the hand behind the only narrative the expedition left. And when researchers identified his remains, recovered from the line of that final march, the bones carried something no one wanted to find. Cut marks. Deliberate, systematic, unmistakable. The kind of marks left by blades, made after death. The evidence meant one thing. After Captain Fitzjames died, his starving crewmates had been forced to seek nourishment from his body. Understand what that finding walked into, because the rumor was as old as the search itself. In the 1850s, Inuit witnesses told search parties what they had seen along the coast, the last survivors starving and the evidence of what starvation had driven them to. When those accounts reached Britain, the Empire did not investigate them. It attacked them. Victorian society declared the reports unthinkable. Royal Navy officers and Christian British gentlemen did not do such things, could not do such things, and anyone repeating the claim was slandering heroes who could no longer defend themselves. The most celebrated writer of the age, Charles Dickens, publicly denounced the accounts and blamed anyone but the crew. The Inuit testimony was dismissed for over a century. Then modern archaeology examined the bones. Across the Franklin sites, human remains carry unmistakable tool marks, cuts positioned at joints and muscle attachments, systematic and consistent, the physical record of men extracting every last possible source of energy from the only thing the Arctic had left them. The Inuit had told the truth the entire time, and Fitzjames makes the truth precise. A captain, one of the expedition's commanders, was not spared by rank. The cold erased hierarchy. The men who survived him were beyond every boundary their civilization had drawn at the absolute limit of human endurance. And here is the part that must be said plainly. Even then, even having crossed that line, they still died. Every one of them. So let the truth land where it belongs. The shame in this story was never in what starving men did to survive. The evidence describes human beings in the final extremity, carrying each other south, holding on past every limit. The shame belongs to the denial, to an empire that called eyewitnesses liars for 100 years rather than face what its ambition had cost. The bones do not accuse the sailors. They accuse the silence. And with that, the full verdict can finally be assembled. What killed the Franklin expedition was not one enemy, but a convergence. Unusually severe ice that gripped the ships and did not let go, season after season. Tinned provisions that may have been poorly prepared from the start. Studies pointing to lead exposure from soldered tins and the ship's water systems wearing down bodies and possibly minds. Scurvy, hollowing them out. Malnutrition, collapsing their immune systems one by one. And behind all of it, the Arctic itself, indifferent to iron plating, steam engines, and naval prestige. No single cause. A machine-age expedition dismantled by everything at once. The three questions from the beginning of this story have now been paid in full. The three graves on Beechey Island were the first warning of a disaster already underway. The face-down skeleton was Harry Peglar, carrying his own words home, and a captain's bones ended the lie, proving the men the Empire called heroes were also human, and proving the witnesses the Empire called liars were honest all along. The mystery is over. What remains is the ice, still holding the rest of the names. The Empire believed technology had mastered the world. The ice crushed that certainty, the cold erased rank, and one of the most powerful nations on Earth was reduced to scattered skeletons on frozen ground. But the DNA era has done for these men what the Empire never could. It gave the bones back their names. Gregory, Orrin, Young, Bridgens, Peglar, Fitzjames. A ghost story has become a roll call of human beings who fought to the absolute end and carried each other as far as flesh allowed. The work continues. Descendants are still coming forward, and more names are still frozen in the ice, waiting to be spoken. The Franklin expedition is no longer a mystery. It is a memorial, finally legible. Like and subscribe. See you in the next exploration.